From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. You know that old-timey saying, you should dance with the one that brought you? For Canada's economy, the United States is the one we usually hit the dance floor with. Our neighbors to the south make up 75% of Canada's foreign trade. Businesses on both sides of the border employ hundreds of thousands of Canadians and Americans. The US election looms closer, and while Canadians don't get to choose, we'll soon know who's asking us to the dance that is the global marketplace. Will it be Donald Trump or Joe Biden? The relationship has had a rocky 4 years. The economic terms of the Canada-US relationship changed for the first time in nearly 25 years with a landmark trade deal, the USMCA.
USMCA has a good ring to it. I have long contended that NAFTA was perhaps the worst trade deal ever made.
The new North American Free Trade Agreement maintains stability for Canada's entire economy.
The health of Canada's economy during the next few years, and in a crisis no less, will depend on how the US economy recovers. Today, we're talking to Edward Keenan, the Toronto Star's Washington bureau chief. He's written a series called Northern Exposure. And if you're asking yourself the question, how does this election affect me? Ed's columns and these podcast episodes will break down the stakes of the election. This one's about how the US and Canada do business together. Is a Trump or a Biden presidency better for the Canadian economy? Ed, it's nice to talk to you again.
It's really nice to talk to you. It's a time when I like hearing voices from home. They're reassuring and calming.
Right, especially in a very uncertain election season. First off, we know the US's economy is vital to Canada's economy, but can you put into context just how important this relationship is to both sides?
I mean, it is very important to both sides. It's particularly important to Canada, particularly in terms of the economy. Like in other ways too, Canada and the United States are long-term sort of partners in the world. And we share a long border, obviously. We share a culture, and Canadians will know that they're very familiar with the cultural products of the United States, our television shows, our internet memes, our movies and music. We share with them both ways. But this is particularly important in the case of the Canadian economy, which is not really an independent economy of the United States. It's not fully integrated or dependent, but it is close to that. It's like a teenager living with their parents to some extent who has their own job and all of that, but things get really ugly if their parents' financial situation changes. And I know a lot of Canadians really get mad at me. I get a lot of emails when I make an analogy like that. Canada has its own sovereignty, but by nature of the size and proximity to the United States, we really have built our economy around the United States in the way that a lot of suburbs economies are built around the cities that they're next to, right? For example, 75% of Canada's export go to the United States. And that is a huge part of the Canadian economy. Over 500,000 jobs in Canada are people directly employed by American companies, by the Canadian offices or Canadian operations of American companies. The direct investment in Canada by Americans is also massive. It's the largest source of direct investment in Canada. And so when we talk about the Canadian economy, we are talking to some extent about the American economy. And if the American economy does not do well, Canadians feel it.
Absolutely. Canada and the US, especially when it comes to the economy, we are codependent on investment, on jobs, on trading, on manufacturing, like you were just mentioning. You can't really separate the two in a real way.
Yeah, I mean, and even in the border closure, which is a bit of a different subject than what we're talking about today, but the nature of that special relationship was recognized immediately when Canada and the United States negotiated with each other a separate agreement on the border closure from the rest of the world, from those countries' policies towards the rest of the world, specifically to allow trade to continue to happen, but to also recognize like a hugely significant number of people who work across the border, who live in Canada and work in the United States, or vice versa. And there are quite a lot of those people, many of them in very important industries. Like we saw healthcare workers, for example, who live in Windsor, who needed to get to Detroit hospitals during the pandemic. But that goes both ways. And so these are integrated economies. And so when Canadians are watching the American election, they are watching a debate about, to some extent, the future state of their own economy. And yet they're helpless to intervene. They don't get a vote.
And I think it's worth revisiting, too, what the last 4 years has looked like in the U.S.-Canada economic relationship. They remain our most important trade partner, but things have sort of changed. Most notably, of course, the USMCA has replaced NAFTA after nearly 25 years. And it was a pretty rough fight to get that deal done. Has Canada's economic relationship with the U.S., has that changed, you think, because of the Trump administration?
The sense that I get, and I'm not an economics expert, I'm not an expert on global trade, but I have spoken to quite a few of them. And the sense I get is that it has been a very turbulent 4 years, as it has been in other areas while Donald Trump has been president. One of Donald Trump's key, most heartfelt, passionately held positions is that tariffs are good, that he should be protectionist of the American economy, and that he should feel free to levy tariffs on other countries. And we saw that. He did that to Canada a couple times, in the case of steel imports, in the case of aluminum. He also hated the NAFTA agreement and threatened to tear it up, and basically at more or less rhetorical gunpoint, forced Canada and Mexico to the table to renegotiate NAFTA. And the deal, which here in the United States is called USMCA, in Canada, I think they call it CUSMA. Everybody likes their country to be first. Most people call it the new NAFTA. The thing about that is that the negotiations were long and hard and kind of tortured, happening with this sword hanging over everybody's neck. At the end of the process, most of the people I've spoken to agree that it's actually kind of a necessary update, depending where you sit on the concept of free trade itself. But most of the experts I've spoken to kind of agree that, in a sense, it's a win for Trump because it winds up being a win-win-win agreement, as Chrystia Freeland of Canada, who negotiated it on behalf of Canada, called it.
All of us together have finally accomplished what we set out to do at the very outset, a win-win-win agreement, which will provide stability for workers in all three of our countries for many years to come.
This was a needed update that we got under terrible circumstances, but that we can all come away fairly happy with, and we'll see about implementing it over the next few years. So in terms of trade, and other than the specific tariff threats and whatnot, the biggest effect that Donald Trump has had on the relationship, from what I can hear, is that he's unpredictable and impulsive, and he kind of launches these surprise offensives at sort of any time. One trade lawyer, Dan Yushko of Dickinson Wright in Ohio, who has long history working in Canadian government on trade and also in the American government on trade. He's really knowledgeable on these things. He characterizes like Trump's trade policy as sort of policy by tweet, right? The president tweets something out and then everybody has to react. And that has made it really difficult for our diplomats, for trade lawyers, and for industries trying to figure out and plan their own future. So there's a level of uncertainty built in. But at this stage, it hasn't been like a major actual disruption to the trading relationship. You don't see it reflected too much outside of specific industries in the kind of numbers and jobs. Much bigger, of course, is the coronavirus-induced recession that both countries are going through now and the government stimulus attached to those. One other thing I wanted to mention, though, about the economic relationship between Canada and the United States that's at stake in this election, but is also, we've been seeing it play out over the last 4 years, is that President Obama had basically vetoed the Keystone XL pipeline, which would carry oil from the Alberta oil sands into the United States.
The State Department has decided that the Keystone XL pipeline would not serve the national interests of the United States. I agree with that decision.
The Canadian oil industry and the Canadian governments have been being boosters of it because they think it's very important to the Canadian economy. Donald Trump greenlit that, has issued more permits necessary to begin construction. The government of Alberta has invested a significant amount of money in that. The government of Canada has invested significant political capital. Joe Biden has again promised that within his first week in office, he would cancel that deal, that he would block it. So the energy trading is another big part of our economic relationship.
Yeah, and I want to get further into that once we sort of get into the scenario. So let's talk about some of those scenarios, and we can talk about the stakes in the upcoming election. Again, you spoke to experts on this bilateral relationship and trade lawyers as well. So if Trump wins, what kind of impact might that have on the Canadian economy? I know it's hard to prognosticate and guess what happens necessarily with Trump, months down the road, but do we have any sense of what that could mean for the Canadian economy?
Well, I mean, it's hard to predict Trump, right? Even day to day, not just year to year, but it's also famously hard to predict what is going to happen to the economy and what will happen under certain circumstances. And, if all these experts who offer forecasts were at all reliable, they wouldn't be experts offering forecasts. They'd be living off the money they made, placing economic bet on their own forecasts, right? There's so many variables and there's so many parts of it. But even for the most esteemed experts I call, it's not a case of them saying, okay, if A happens, then it means Canadian employment is going to go way up and then we'll have a chicken in every pot. You just can't read the tea leaves that way, or at least I can't. And the people I've been talking to can't. But when you look at the different parts of it, there are certain things that you can expect would be different under Donald Trump and under Joe Biden, and certain things that you can expect wouldn't be different. And all of those will have a sort of echo effects into the Canadian economy. That is hard to pinpoint exactly what that effect will be and to what extent, but you can say, we will feel that in Canada. And so no one I talked to expected that necessarily Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau, if Justin Trudeau remains prime minister, nobody expected necessarily that their relationship was going to get much better, right? It runs hot and cold, but generally they don't particularly get along well. And they don't have the kind of warm diplomatic relationship that Canada and the US are used to having, where Canada is sort of a priority partner for American presidents traditionally. Donald Trump will often characterize Canada as a sort of like national security threat, right? In the context of trade. That's a big difference. And while that's like sort of what we read in the headlines, it's also sort of what gets felt in the background.
We'll be right back. Okay, Trump and his actions are tough to predict. But what about Biden? Do we have a sense of how he sees Canada economically?
Joe Biden, his last official visit as vice president was to Canada. He spoke there very warmly about the relationship.
We're Americans and we're Canadian. Had I a glass, I'd toast you by saying, Viva la Canada, because we need you very, very badly. Thank you.
People expect that if Joe Biden is the president, there will be a warmer personal relationship between the leader, and not just the leaders, but sort of the cabinet level contacts back and forth. And there will also be a sort of a more normal, traditional relationship, not just with Canada, but with the whole world when it comes to things like trade policy, where there are sort of predictable rules and principles that American policy is based on. And whether Canadians agree with those rules and principles or not, they know what the decision-making apparatus in the United States is based on, and they make their arguments in negotiations based on that. From the people I've talked to, one of the hardest things about negotiating with Trump or dealing with Trump from the outside is that you're not sure how to make an argument for your side. You're not sure how to get into the negotiation because you're not sure what they really want. Or you're not playing by the traditional agreed upon rules. He keeps changing the rules and he keeps changing the objectives. People expect Joe Biden would, first of all, have a warmer relationship and second of all, a more predictable relationship. But Joe Biden's trade policy, for example, and his economic policy is not necessarily completely aligned with what Canada would want, right? I gave the example of the Keystone Pipeline as one thing, but The Democratic Party historically has been as protectionist or more protectionist. There's a stronger anti-free trade strain inside the Democratic Party than there is in the Republican Party traditionally. And now Trump notwithstanding and his love of tariffs. Where Donald Trump and Joe Biden line up when you get down to the actual issues of trade is not too far apart. Nobody that I have heard of right now is talking about, not inside Canada, not inside the Democratic Party, not inside the Republican Party, nobody's talking about renegotiating USMCA again. That's the deal we've got, and it looks, to the extent that you can predict these things, like everybody's going to stick with it. But in terms of how things get implemented, and in terms of, again, like American procurement policies, which can have effects for Canadian companies that are trading with the US, where the US is, say, doling out stimulus and they're giving X billion dollars to build infrastructure, and so then they limit that bidding, say, to American companies, or they put limits where a certain amount of these materials have to come from American companies. That kind of backdoor buy American protectionism that's not in the trade agreement itself, but will be part of American policies, will affect Canadian companies. But from what I've heard, not too many people expect that effect to be significantly different between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And to the extent that things go one way or the other, they expect that Congress is going to be a bigger player in determining the details of that than the presidents themselves, right? And so to an extent, that's at stake for Canada in the election, that trade relationship, but from a different way, other than predictability and the warmth of the relationship, in policy terms, not a lot of people I know see too much daylight between the major candidates in nuts and bolts policy terms that would have big picture impact on the Canadian economy when it comes to trade itself.
So whether Biden wins or Trump wins, the American government will still want to push American business interests, is what you're saying.
Earlier today, I signed a proclamation that defends American industry by reimposing aluminum tariffs on Canada. Canada was taking advantage of us, as usual.
And maybe with the Democrats, it's more the devil that you know. Versus Trump, we've already seen with USMCA just a week before it was about to go into action, Trump was threatening Canada with aluminum tariffs. Those are kind of the sort of almost mood swings that can change the relationship a little bit. But for the most part, you're saying there's not a huge difference in terms of policy between the two.
Yeah, and especially now that Trump got his win, as he thinks of it, on NAFTA, right? And the congressional Democrats think of it as a win for them too, because they rewrote significant portions of it. But still, Trump had that bee in his bonnet. He was pushing it really hard. He declares it a victory for himself. And so now he's got that. You wouldn't expect something on that level again. A couple of different trade lawyers I talked to who are very well connected, they think sort of Trump and his sort of trade team accomplished their broad objectives on that front in the first term. And so they'd expect it to be somewhat less turbulent in the second term, although somewhat less turbulent for Donald Trump is maybe different than what you think of as less turbulent for anybody else. There are different issues, as we were talking about, for the oil industry. The Keystone Pipeline is a big one, and the government of Canada and the government of Alberta have invested quite a lot in Keystone Pipeline. What that pipeline itself would do would bring Canadian oil sands oil, which environmentalists particularly hate because oil sands oil is dirtier than almost every other kind of oil. They have to mine it out of the ground and refine it in a way that's a lot more resource intensive. And so, that major pipeline, part of why environmentalists oppose it is that a pipeline like that is a commitment to the Canadian oil industry, right? It is such a large project to carry so much product down to the American market that it's basically a commitment to buy Canadian oil for decades. You can see why environmentalists are afraid of something like that, but you can also see why those who think that the Alberta oil industry is a really fundamentally important part of Canada's economy and will remain so, would want that pipeline built and have banked quite a lot on having that pipeline built. Again, Joe Biden has promised very clearly, very specifically, that he's going to cancel that pipeline right away.
We got a statement from the Biden campaign which says Biden strongly opposed the Keystone Pipeline in the last administration, stood alongside President Obama and Secretary Kerry to reject it in 2015, and will proudly stand in the Roosevelt Room again as president to stop it for good by rescinding the Keystone XL pipeline permit.
Justin Trudeau has said, I'm going to work with whoever's elected and I'm going to make it clear to them how important this is to us. Likely that's dead. if Joe Biden is elected president. And the Canadian oil industry is going to have to adapt to that. I mean, they'll continue to try and lobby, or dead for now, as the case may be, right?
And in any case, the Canadian oil and gas industry, it is in their interest to make sure that the Keystone XL pipeline does continue. And presently under Trump, it would continue.
That's right. I mean, Trump's a big booster of that. Trump is a big booster of all kinds of fossil fuel. I mean, sorry, I hate to laugh, but it is interesting. Maybe at some other point, we'll talk about climate change. Trump campaigns on his support for the fossil fuel industry, on oil and gas and coal. He wants these pipelines built. He wants them carrying as much product as possible. For them, that would be a big win if Trump were the president. Aside from the specifics of the trading relationship, aside from specific policies like the Keystone XL, just the general shape of the American economy has a shadow effect on the Canadian economy. And it's not lockstep. The Canadian housing market bounced back really fast after the global economic crisis. The American one did not. It's not one market because of the need for back and forth trade, because of the investment environment. There is a real connection between if the Americans stay in a recession, that's more likely to keep Canada in a recession for a longer period of time. And so this sort of general economic policy, domestic economic policy of the United States is potentially an economic driver in Canada as well. Democrats have the opposite approach to that. They are traditionally thought of as the party of big government, but they have been trying to pump more money into the economy. And Joe Biden, basically part of his coronavirus platform is based on economic stimulus. We haven't seen the details that would bear this out, but he's sometimes talked about the need for a New Deal like investment in getting the American economy going again. You can pick your economic experts from the left or the right who will tell you which they think will work, a more laissez-faire approach, a hands-back approach, or a targeted approach that includes a lot of tax cuts and trickle-down stuff, or the sort of direct investment in infrastructure and jobs and unemployed workers. They're likely to have different approaches to that. And whether or not they succeed in sort of rescuing the American economy and bringing it back from the coronavirus is going to have a big effect on Canada, which, has spent a significant amount of money on its own stimulus and bailouts and whatnot, and incurred a tremendous amount of debt to do that. Canada's banked a lot on that approach. And yet how that plays out in the long term in Canada is going to have a relationship with what the Americans do in the long term and how it plays out here.
And there's no doubt that in the middle of a pandemic, of a recession, some say a depression, how the U.S. economy recovers is directly tied to how Canada's economy recovers too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. The thing is that it would be a lot more fun and a lot easier if we could say, if Biden is elected, X, Y, and Z will happen. And you, Adrian, in Toronto are going to get a raise, right? And if Trump is elected, then A, B, and C are going to happen. And your cousin in Oshawa is going to lose his job or something like that, or vice versa. Just randomly picking examples. It's hard to draw those kind of things. It's hard to predict the future in the first place. But beyond that, the economies are so complicated and the policies are so many and varied and complicated. And the effects they have, especially across the border, are not always direct, but they're real. And Canadians know that we feel it, right? Anybody who's lived through the recession of the early 1990s or the early 1980s, that were really hangover recessions or shadow recessions that we went through with the United States, will understand that the effect on Canadians individually even is real. Like for individual Canadians. I think most people watching can develop a sense in their gut or in their brain of which suite of policies that are being proposed in and around this election might be better for Canada or worse for Canada, or better for certain parts of the Canadian economy or worse for certain parts of the Canadian economy. It's not as simple as being able to say, if Americans vote for this guy, this is what happens, because it's so big and sophisticated.
Yeah, it's not an A-B decision when it comes to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
Ed, thank you for your reporting, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Adrian. It's always a pleasure. I hope to talk to you again soon.
That's Edward Keenan, the Toronto Star's Washington bureau chief. We'll have more episodes about the U.S. election and what it means for Canada with Ed later this month. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.